All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us with another live session. My name is Manny Fragilis, and we have the opportunity of having Pete Zoppi, who's a senior character artist at Treyarch, join us for this live session. So Pete is teaching. He's teaching the character creation for film and cinematics class with CGMA. He's been teaching this class for the last term or so. And also he's just been with CGMA for the last couple of years. So once again, guys, it's like if you have any questions, definitely feel free to just throw them on the chat window, and I'll get through them as we go through the session. Pete is taking time from work during his lunch break to entertain us and amuse us and provide us with some tips and tricks. In terms of, as far as how he goes about creating these amazing characters. And so we're trying to get through all your questions, but if we're not able to, definitely feel free to just email us and we'll respond accordingly. So, all right, without further ado, I guess I'll hand it over to Pete.
Cool. Thanks, Manny. Thanks for having me. So I've been teaching with CGMA for a few years now, been teaching the courses and putting the content together. And I'm also a senior character artist at Treyarch, where I've been working there for about 8 or 9 years now. So I've been with Activision, between a different studio with Activision and then over at Treyarch for about 9 years now. So, and I just recently wrapped up work in the fall on Black Ops 3. And I'm just currently supporting that game at the studio with, creating additional content for the game. I guess we'll talk a little bit about the character creation for film and cinematics class to begin with. So this is a character that was put together for the class, and the class covers everything from the initial block out of the character, collecting reference, and then working up through using a variety of different software to create the entire character. So everything from modeling, sculpting, texturing, lighting, shading in Maya with V-Ray. So kind of covers the entire range of doing the character, and it occurs relatively later on in the actual curriculum. So a lot of the content sort of assumes that there's a foundation already laid out from some of the previous courses. So while it does go in depth, it's not showing every single modeling of every single aspect of the character. Some of that could get a little bit redundant, but it covers all of the important parts and kind of troubleshooting and working through problems and issues that kind of come up with this sort of stuff. So I guess we can, with that kind of intro, I don't know, do you want to start with just start going through some questions, and we can kind of get the ball rolling with that?
Yeah, definitely. So first question we have here is, as a writer and story artist, I make a character bio / outline for new ideas. Does Pete do something similar?
So kind of similar, but maybe not to the extent of something that a writer would do. Having worked in film and video games, there's certainly that sort of work is done by story teams and writers where, they come up with full bios for characters, where the character was born, maybe some information about their childhood or how they kind of got to be where they are. And that stuff can certainly serve as some very good information for designing a character. But, for the purposes of a class like this, or a lot of any other character work I do, I don't necessarily write up a full bio, but I certainly do enough research and collect reference to get the important parts of the character for the state that the character is currently in. So, for example, this character here, for getting him to this kind of visual quality level, I don't necessarily have to write up or spend time on a full bio as to, how he kind of got to where he is. Sometimes that stuff can help a little bit, and, having writers that can do that certainly helps, but, I'm not trained as a writer to kind of come up with that stuff. So it always is nice in a production environment to kind of get that information, because that can help inform certain decisions you make on the character. But for these types of purposes, I don't go super in depth with like a full-on bio.
Cool. No, that makes complete sense. What is DevGru?
DevGru is a United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group, which is essentially like a SEAL team. And having done some research, I guess technically it's SEAL Team 6, which I guess is not technically used anymore. It's typically referred to as DevGru, but it's essentially SEAL Team or like a Delta Force or elite soldiers that kind of do missions and operations that are pretty secretive. Doing some of the research, most of the research, led me to believe that these are the types of operations and missions that, the White House doesn't typically comment on, or they're kind of deniable operations, that sort of thing. So it's essentially elite, a name for elite soldier groups like SEAL teams.
Okay, cool. And what type of references are given for a character like this? So dig into some of your, some of the references and what you use.
So let me just I'll pull up some of the references. So usually when I'm putting a character like this together, I collect as much reference as possible, and that can come from anywhere. So if we look in my reference folder here, I have everything from this type of stuff, which is like 6-scale figures that are fairly accurate, to any sort of real world photography information. Part of doing this kind of work really is collecting a whole bunch of reference and then being able to kind of pick out from the reference the necessary parts that you need. So a lot of the reference here is more just military related reference, which may help inform certain decisions on creating, for example, the radio that's physically accurate, or certain types of pouches. Some of this stuff isn't something that maybe a SEAL team or this type of soldier would particularly wear, but collecting as much reference as possible and being able to sort through that stuff and figure out what parts would go where. And sometimes with military stuff, it can be kind of deceiving too, because there's a very popular sport called airsoft, which is basically a souped up version of paintball, where they use like little plastic BBs, but they use really a lot of replica gear. So a lot of the reference that I collected too a lot of it was from airsoft. So being able to discern and tell the differences between some of that stuff. So for example, like airsoft gear, for example, on like the vest, which is typically called a plate carrier. A lot of those plate carriers carry like bulletproof plates in them, but potentially for an airsoft engagement, you wouldn't necessarily need that type of protection on your character. And that type of stuff can inform how heavy that piece of gear looks, how it sits on the character. So it's important not only to like look at the reference, but try to figure out exactly where that reference is coming from and how applicable some of that information actually is to what you're working on. So I go through and collect as much reference as possible, just browsing Google. Part of the job of a character artist really is being able to do some of the necessary research and figure out a lot of these parts. And again, with being a character artist, one day or one project I may be tasked with working on something realistic like this soldier, and then the next project could be something completely stylized, with, you could think of, either Blizzard type style or something like League of Legends. You could, as a character artist, you could be tasked with a variety of different styles. So a lot of it is just doing research and finding the important parts to apply to your character. So this is a whole bunch of the different reference. So I have broken stuff up into separate groups, like clothing, shoes, all different plate carriers. So I have a whole folder of different vests and different plate carriers, just to look at how the stitching is laid on, how it's actually constructed. And I think that's important to really think about when you're doing this kind of work, is thinking about the actual manufacturing process of a lot of this stuff, because that can really help inform how you build it. And it starts to make more sense when you think about how, all these garments are laid out with flat pieces of fabric, and then how is it draped around, and what's the purpose of this stitching, and how are these loops kind of stitched onto here. So I like to think about everything from that standpoint, as well as sort of the manufacturing process, because that can really inform a lot of the decisions you make. And so this is just a whole bunch of reference. So I kind of break things up into a variety of different folders for different parts of the character, so I can easily kind of browse through and be able to accurately assess what I need to build.
Yeah, and it's amazing, and it shows in the character. because the attention to detail that you have within that character is amazing. So,
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
and it all goes back to references, right?
Yeah, I mean, for example, another part is when you look, some of the reference that I'll collect as well. We'll cover this in a little bit, some of the face stuff, but I took some photos of different types of military garments, and then what I can do is zoom in really tight here and be able to really accurately mimic the different types of fabric weave. So when you look at one type of gear, if you look at it, there's a variety of different really intricate fabric weaves that are obviously tileable, but they can be really easily recreated in 3D instead of trying to convert this into a bump map or something like that. It's relatively easy to convert. When you really look closely at these little fabric weaves, you can really accurately recreate this, and that's what a lot of the sort of tertiary detail is from collecting this type of reference and looking extremely close at the fabric weaves and kind of recreating this stuff in 3D to be used as either displacement or bump maps. So there's different levels of reference. So you have kind of the broad reference that's collected to kind of see what pieces of gear are on the character, how they're manufactured, and then as you kind of get a little bit further along in the process, you kind of go deeper and deeper and start to add in this tertiary detail of fabric weaves and that sort of stuff. So
cool.
Yeah.
Wow, amazing work, dude. Do you shoot your own references?
Yeah, so I shot a lot of this. This wasn't, some games used to do this, even I think to a certain extent, some, that photos may be projected on a geometry. I prefer to shoot this and use this as a reference to actually recreate the actual fabric weaves in 3D. And if you really think about it, this is relatively straightforward to recreate this. These are basically, each of these little fabric weaves are essentially like torus primitives in Maya that you could put together in this pattern and create a height map out of it. So it's relatively easy to put that together. So I shoot a lot of this stuff for my own reference when I need this type of information. And then I also shoot for the purposes of skin. If we come here, I basically shot a whole bunch of information of my own head for texture purposes, and a lot of this was shot with a cross polarized light setup to eliminate all of the reflection and specular highlights. So it's not quite to like a completely professional level that you may receive from like a visual effects photo shoot or something like that. But for kind of a sort of entry-level setup, it works pretty well to shoot cross-polarized information, and it really helps with the texture painting process. You basically are eliminating all of the highlight information off of the surface, so these images project onto the surface pretty well, and you can basically get a whole bunch of detail out of it that you wouldn't notice otherwise. When you kind of compare this cross-polarized information with with something that's not cross-polarized, you realize how much of a sheen there is over the surface of the skin. So this is just with regular lighting. You can see even close up, there's a certain sheen over the surface that kind of hides a lot of the detail information that's on this, that's actually in the skin. So, I shoot a lot of this stuff myself for texture purposes. Some of this stuff is, it's available now as well. You can purchase some cross-polarized information as well. There's different sites that sell this type of stuff, but it is really nice to be able to have your own camera and be able to shoot reference when you need it for very specific purposes. So yeah, I do shoot a lot of my own stuff.
Cool, great. Did you use scan data for the modeling?
No, there was no scan data in terms of like 3D scan data. The only like kind of scan or photographic information would be from skin images like this, or as I mentioned, I'll show in a little bit. Actually, I can bring it up now. If we look here, a lot of the high frequency detailing was all done with the texturing XYZ maps. So if I come into my image browser here, this is all photographically captured, and this stuff is really, really awesome to use for high frequency bump map painting. If the goal really is photorealism, and you're trying to make things as believable and realistic as possible, certainly you can use 3D scans of stuff, but sometimes 3D scans of objects come with their own sets of problems. There's a significant amount of cleanup involved with that. But this type of information is really, really handy to be able to use as high frequency bump map painting. I've purchased up a whole bunch of these different maps from Texturing XYZ to use, and really, I mean, so you could look at it as being a little on the expensive side potentially, but when you factor in the amount of time you potentially save by using this information, maybe a head might typically take several days to maybe even a week to do all, from scratch by hand, all the high frequency bump map painting. And then if you have these images here, you could potentially speed that process up and maybe get that done in half a day or a day. So that I kind of look at things that way, is how much time will certain things save me and what's the quality level I can get out of it. So yeah, I use a lot of the Texturing XYZ stuff for the bump map painting, because it adds a nice level of believability that you can certainly do by hand, but it takes more time. And if this information is available, why not use it?
Yeah, I completely agree. Especially when you're doing something that's realistic, right?
Yeah. Yep.
It only makes sense. So when you have when you just have picture references, how do you get the measurements right?
So picture references, measurements can be kind of difficult to get exactly right. Sometimes you can actually go on different manufacturers' websites, and sometimes they actually have technical information that you can find for particular objects. But then, I mean, then there comes a certain point too where, depending on the application or how you're using the type of character, at the end of the day, this is it is an artistic process. So you do want it to be as realistic as possible, but if it becomes a completely scientific process, then it kind of takes some of that fun away from it. So there is still the need to be able to analyze photo reference, look at the relationships between certain forms, and be able to kind of figure out some of those measurements. But for most of the character, most of the gear on the character, I didn't really measure things out exactly. It was mostly just, again, by eye, kind of looking at relationships between different size pouches and that sort of thing. But I think one thing that I always do, though, when you speak of measurements, is I always work in some sort of real world scale units in Maya. So I set my scene size to centimeters and measure out like a 6 foot tall person. So I know that I'm always working in some sort of scale that I can always kind of go back to and make sure that everything is in sync properly. And that not only helps for building the character, but also when you get to lighting, rendering, and shading. So a lot of your shading and lighting can get completely thrown off if the character you're building is like 1,000 times too small than it should be, or if it's way larger, then sometimes your light intensities get thrown off, and it can really kind of wreak havoc on you. It becomes hard to diagnose problems when you're not working in some sort of actual scale units.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Do you use some sort of plugins for modeling human body and face? If so, which ones are they?
I don't really use any plugins. For the most part, I do all of my head sculpting and body work. If I step down all the way, I have a base mesh that kind of changes from project to project as I iterate on it. But I generally start with a base mesh that's already laid out and is set up properly scaled and all that stuff. This just makes it easier to work from project to project. I can always import this base mesh head. It's the proper size, human size head. The eyeballs are the right size. But in terms of like plugins, no, I don't use anything additionally. The body usually starts, I can start with like the Mudbox base body, and then I can resurface that if needed to create better topology on it. But the heads, I usually start all my heads with a base topology here that works not only for being able to have UVs on it, but it works for deformation. It works for sculpting. So there's a lot that I like doing from base mesh heads. So no, I don't really use any additional plugins or scripts. Mostly it's just hand modeled in Maya and then sculpted in Mudbox. Cool.
How do you see photogrammetry and 3D scanning changing the role of a character artist in the future?
I mean, certainly there's going to be, more applications for that. There's certain things that can be done. I think, just even looking at, for example, the texturing XYZ stuff, it's kind of a form of photogrammetry in terms of using photo reference to scan and get particular information. I think there's still a need for, to be able to do things by hand and make things from scratch. I think an over-reliance on photogrammetry and scanning, even when you do that, there's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done to get that information and that data into some sort of usable package for production. So even if you scan stuff, there's still going to be required a certain amount of time to resurface that, transfer detail over, put it on an organized mesh that can then be rigged and textured. So, I don't see, I mean, I could be wrong, but I don't see in the really near future the role of a character artist being, really, really diminished because of scan information. There's still a need to create organized meshes and get them production ready. So, and the course that, throughout the course, I talk a lot about that is, being organized and having clean meshes that are easily able to be texture painted on, rigged, skinned. There's a whole variety of reasons why you want to have organized, clean meshes from a production standpoint. It just makes everyone's life a lot easier. So I don't see photogrammetry as diminishing much of the character art pipeline. Certainly there's uses for it, and I think we'll be able to extract more information off of photography to use on characters, but I don't see it completely like diminishing the role of a character artist.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Can I start blocking my character in Maya with right topology, then take it to ZBrush to apply details that will help me to ignore the retopology step?
Yeah, actually, I do that a lot. Or it depends. Like sometimes I'll transition from phase to phase. So let me just bring up a different copy of Maya so I can import something. So that there's a lot of value in doing that, kind of being organized from the beginning. If you know exactly what it is you have to build, you can get that mesh sorted out in Maya and then sculpt on it, and that can be kind of your final mesh. For example, I'll do stuff like this. So this is from Marvelous Designer, and this was exported out. From here, I create a nice, clean, organized mesh on top of this that then serves as my jumping off point to do any further sculpting. But the mesh that goes on top of this actually encompasses all of these individual folds. So if we come back and look here in Maya here, this is the shirt here. So the topology here has all of those major folds built into it. All of the seam lines are actually built in. So sometimes it's kind of a two-step process to get to that point, but I try as much as possible to have organized meshes from a fairly early on point that I can then start sculpting on, and then I can extract. It allows me to easily transition from the sculpting phase into the texture painting phase without having to stop and resurface something and then transfer the mesh information. So the earlier I can get clean, organized meshes, the better it is for me. It just allows me to transition easily between sculpting, texture painting, rigging, and skinning. As soon as I start to have to stop and resurface and then transfer information from one mesh to another and then do a little bit more work, and then I realize, I messed something up. I got to do that whole process over again and change a few things. That's where things can start to get a little frustrating. So, and that a lot of that I cover a lot of that in the class content with trying to be as organized and clean as possible from an early stage, because it can save you a significant amount of time later on down the pipeline.
Cool. So, and speaking of animation, speaking of animation, just production in general, do you think about how a character will be animated when you're designing or creating a character?
Yeah. So very often, what I like to do is get a block out of the character done, which encompasses maybe not every single part of the character, but at least the bulk of the character is blocked out. And for example, I might just put like a cube or something for where this pouch is, and a lot of times that can get rigged and skinned relatively quick, and that can flag any sort of potential issues with collision of objects if something's clipping through something else, or it may reveal certain issues that may crop up that may be required to be dealt with in a different way. So, for example, like the retention lanyard that he has hooked onto his belt, maybe I block this out with this as it's supposed to appear on the character, and I hand that off to rigging, and they may come back and say, you know what, if this is going to be animated and this needs to like flap around and stuff, it's probably better to model this completely straight, and then they can put some sort of constraint on the each end of each carabiner here and clip it onto the belt, and then there can be some sort of dynamic simulation that works that way. And that blockout process can occur pretty quick, but it can reveal a lot of issues and solve certain things that you would do on the character when you start modeling and texturing. So like I said, this would be a candidate for maybe being modeled completely straight. Even this, the radio cord up here again would be a scenario where the rigger may say, it's going to be better to model this completely straight, and then he can get it attached onto the character properly. So yeah, the blackout phase I think can reveal a lot of good things about the pipeline that you're going to be moving into, that it'll allow you to solve certain problems earlier on and not potentially waste time modeling things in a certain way that then the rigger comes back and says, oh, hey, this is going to be a pain to rig this way. Let's do it a different way. So yeah, the blackout is usually can be done pretty quick, and again, it can resolve certain issues and allow you to work a little bit faster throughout the entire character.
Cool, great. So speaking of just animation, do AAA game studios use sites like Mixamo for quick and dirty skinning, or is that something that you would have your character TDs do? And in this case, as relates to this character in particular, did you do your own skinning, or did you have someone else do that?
So skinning is, everywhere I've worked, the skinning is always done in-house. We have every modeling team I've ever worked on, there's a tech team, a character tech team that does the rigging and skinning. And we work pretty closely with those guys because there's certain issues that pop up, and it's kind of a back and forth dialogue to resolve problems. For something like this, I do use a plugin in Maya called the Setup Machine for doing automated rigging. I'm not a rigger by trade. I can probably lay some joints out and apply some skinning, but this type of software, this auto rigging piece of software, is really nice because it allows me to just basically place some manipulators around the character where major forms are, and then it goes through and builds a rig with very specific controls on it. And then I have control over just going into the character and addressing some of the weight painting issues. So a lot of times the auto rigging solutions, there will be some skinning cleanup that needs to occur. But the cool thing is I can kind of take this and really quickly start to pose this out. This gives me, there's all different controls on here. If I select the fingers here, I have controls over the rotations of the joints. So a lot of stuff that would take me, I might be able to set some of this stuff up, but it would take me a much longer amount of time. And I typically just use this for being able to quickly iterate on character poses. Not so much for, obviously I don't do any animation. I've never actually handed off a character that's been set up with this piece of software for animation, but for me, it serves a really good way of getting a pretty quick rig on the character. Within a few hours I can have a rig on the character, and I can pretty quickly start posing things out, and it gives me a lot of those additional controls. So if we look down at like the feet, for example, there's different controls on here for heel swiveling. So stuff that's, if you're not a rigger, you're gonna probably have trouble getting a character set up. I think this software was like $100. I bought it
What's the name of it?
4 or 5 years ago, and it's worked out really, really well.
What is the name of the plugin?
It's called the Setup Machine.
Okay, the Setup Machine.
Yep. Yeah, it
Okay,
works really
cool.
well. I like using it for doing all my posing stuff because it's nice because it's non-destructive. Obviously, like I can rig this mesh, and I can really quickly play with different poses and set keyframes on different keys here, so I can iterate quickly on different poses. So I think in this scene here, yeah. So you can see here, I basically just scrub through here and I come up with a variety of different poses that I think may work. I play with a lot of different ideas, and then this software allows me to really quickly iterate and test out a bunch of different poses. Once it's rigged, within like an hour or two, I can do 4, 5, 6 different poses, and then I can start to pick ones that I think are working, and then iterate on those a little bit further and tweak them from there. But it's cool that it's non-destructive, and it has everything. The entire character is on here. So I basically, and it's kind of a workflow thing too. I generally use Maya as like my sort of hub for all of the work that I do. So everything kind of obviously collects back up in Maya, but this goes for some game work as well, where there's usually not a scenario where I have the entire high poly character constructed in one scene in like Mudbox or ZBrush. For the most part, this, even without displacement maps on here, with just pure poly modeling, everything is essentially accounted for here. I don't, if push came to shove, I could potentially render this without displacements, and it could maybe hold up in the background as a background character or something like that. But I generally try to have everything accounted for in the poly mesh, so that everything else is kind of like icing on the cake. All the displacements, all the bump information is kind of another nice layer on top of things. So Maya generally serves as like the hub that everything kind of starts from, and then I can send a particular mesh out. Like if I want to detail this pouch, I can send this one pouch out and sculpt and detail that alone, and not have a massive scene file that's several gigs large and takes forever to open and close and save, and so it's an efficiency thing too, to be able to work pretty quickly, sending meshes in and out of Maya for detailing and texture painting and that sort of stuff.
Cool. So since we have this, the character up, and I know you mentioned Marvelous Designer before. Obviously, you use Marvelous Designer for this character. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my knowledge and expertise with Marvelous Designer is not, it's fairly minimal. I can get in there and do some basic stuff. So if we look back here, really what I was trying to get out of it was just the general simulation, just get the bulk of the actual folds here, so that I have the general shirt. And what I did was I looked at the reference and figured out where the actual seam lines would be. So if you look here, all these parts are actually unwelded. So when I looked at the shirt, there's basically, you could see here, these are the actual fabric patterns that have been laid out. And so I keep this stuff this way, so that the camouflage on the sleeve is only apparent on this part, on the collar, on this part of the sleeve. So I block the clothing patterns out in Marvelous Designer, keeping in mind the actual construction of the garment. And so, this portion of the shirt here, all of this stuff is just kind of like a gray, light gray fabric, whereas the other parts are all camouflage. So I usually, it's really very basic. And then I can send this into ZBrush and make poly groups out of these individual parts. And then when I Z remesh it, I can keep the groups. And then once it's Z remeshed, I still have these poly groups intact. I can basically do use some of the poly grouping and like group loops and that sort of thing to be able to get a mesh here that has the seam lines essentially built into the mesh. And this is really, really helpful, having the seam lines actually built onto the mesh, obviously for deformation purposes, but for texture painting, once this is UV'd, I know exactly where the seam lines are. It just makes the whole process of sculpting, texture painting, and all that stuff a little bit more seamless. So again, Marvelous Designer I use it very, very minimally, just to get the bulk of the information. And I think I listened to the webinar last week, and John was saying that he originally started with doing less work in Marvelous Designer, but as he's become more comfortable, he does more and more work in it. I'm still at that phase where I just want to get the bulk of the information out. So this might comprise 30% of the actual shirt, and then from here it gets resurfaced, makes a clean, organized mesh onto it, and then from here I can get it UV'd and start to work through doing additional sculpting and texture painting. So if we look at the UVs on this, I've got the UVs laid out on this, and so now I can really seamlessly move between sculpting and texture painting on this. So I can go start sculpting this, and then where I want to add kind of high frequency detail like stitching and that sort of thing, I can go into the bump map painting in Mudbox and just start painting the bump map on here and paint all the seam lines and that sort of stuff. So this workflow works for me because it just allows me to get a clean, organized mesh that I can then that encompasses most of the folds, and then I can keep on I can keep working it from there.
Okay, cool. And Laura's asking, how do you tackle creating the clean Maya version of your Marvelous cloth? You recreate it manually, or are there shortcuts? And obviously, it seems like you just recreate it manually, right?
Well, actually, this worked pretty well using Z Remesher.
Okay.
So I use Z Remesher to do it, and it gave me, for the most part, a pretty usable garment. And then from there was some manual cleanup. I actually did come in and, once using like the group loops, I had basically loops that were running along these seam lines. The cool thing about this workflow too is using the poly groups. And this is covered in the class as well, but using that, doing it with poly groups is I can kind of come in here, and once I get into UVing, I can pretty quickly select the entire seam line here and cut that. So I don't have to actually spend a lot of time coming in here and being like, oh, this is a seam line. Oh, no, I have to come here and slice it here and keep slicing across. This makes it really, really easy to manipulate this geometry for UVs and that sort of thing. So it's a mix of, using Z-Remesher to see what that kind of gives me, and then I can kind of clean it up from there. The nice thing about Z-Remesher is that it gives me, all of this information, all of this fold information that would actually be pretty time consuming to manually retopologize. So I'll usually use that as like my first shot. I'll use Z-Remesher. That's like the first pass at it, see what that gives me, and then I'll start to clean up things manually where needed.
Cool. And obviously you've mentioned Mudbox, throughout this session so far. Someone is asking, why do you prefer Mudbox over ZBrush for sculpting?
I started using Mudbox back when it first came out, and there was just something about the way the brushes feel and the actual camera. So I really I know ZBrush has the kind of the perspective in there, but to me, it still felt a little bit off. And sometimes when I'm sculpting, I like to be able to, and a lot of this is covered in the course as well, at least when doing heads, is when you're looking at reference, I think it's really, really important to be able to discern on the reference what sort of camera focal length was used when that reference was shot, because that plays a really, really large role in like the relationships between the forms on the head. And so just being able to come into Mudbox here and select my camera and dial in an appropriate field of view, which has a correlation to the actual focal length, allows me, if I'm working heavily from photographed reference, I can set this field of view to the exact focal length of the camera lens that was used to shoot that reference, and it helps me to sculpt a little better. Mudbox doesn't have all of the different types of brushes that ZBrush has, and a lot of the functionality in terms of like doing hard surface stuff, but just from a pure kind of organic sculpting, once I know exactly what it is I have to build, I prefer to do the work on an organized mesh in ZBrush. ZBrush I can use for doing, concepting things, kind of coming up with ideas on the fly, because it's really, really flexible with using Dynamesh and that sort of stuff to kind of be able to do things on the fly. But then once I'm kind of locked in and know exactly what it is I need to build, I get that organized, clean mesh, and I can start sculpting. And then the other reason, again, too, is, for example, the shirt here, using Mudbox with the bump map painting, so I can texture paint and sculpt kind of at the same time. So I may find on this shirt that, I don't need to actually sculpt in with, having the shirt be 20 million polygons. I don't need to sculpt in every single stitch line. I can do that with a texture and do that with a bump map. So it kind of allows me to transition between sculpting and texture painting really, really easily.
Cool.
So yeah, I guess it's like a personal preference. It's a personal workflow that I've come up with, and just it kind of works for me.
Okay, great. And does baking assets from high down to low poly ever come into play with cinematic work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of game studios now are doing in-game cinematics. So, I've done some work at my game studio with in-game cinematic stuff. So we get, with in-game cinematics, the poly count can be a little bit higher, but it still kind of has to be a game res asset. But it's still, you get a little bit more flexibility with a cinematic in-game character. So, but the initial, the workflow where you're essentially building the high poly, it's very, very similar, 50% of the way through the process. And then obviously the process starts to deviate a little bit, whether you're going for a pre-rendered cinematic where you're doing displacement mapping and high-end shaders, or if you're going more towards a game pipeline. So when you start to get into UVing and extracting maps, that's where things deviate a little bit between doing film and cinematic and doing game type work. But cool. The bulk of the work up to that point is quite similar.
All right, great. So Man, it's Pete, you're doing an amazing job.
Cool.
We still have quite a few more questions, so there's a good chance we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but we're going to try our best. So,
Sure.
now let's start. Let's start talking about just the rendering and getting a
Sure.
character like this, to have that quality, that photorealistic or hyper realistic quality that you've been able to achieve. And obviously shading, lighting, rendering plays, a huge role in that. So, did you use Substance, for this character, and did you have to resculpt over the textures for displacement maps? I guess it's a two-part question.
Yeah, so I used Substance Painter for pretty much all of that. It was a mix of Mudbox and Substance Painter. So Mudbox was used at an earlier phase for, some of the stitching and that sort of thing. And then once I was ready to really kind of get into the texture painting, I used Substance Painter. Now, there were some things, the reason I went with Substance Painter, at least for this type of project, is because he really is broken up into a lot of different individual pieces. Whereas, Substance Painter currently doesn't have support for doing UDIMs. So if you had like a massive creature that for a cinematic or film pipeline would need to have a whole bunch of UV tiles, Substance Painter wouldn't be the best choice for that. You'd probably want to go with something like Mari. But because of the nature of this character, that he's really broken up into a whole bunch of individual different pieces, I was able to essentially leverage Substance Painter and do all of these individual pieces by themselves. So yeah, I did most of that. And again, a lot of the ability to use Substance Painter also came down to the fact that my meshes here encompass pretty much everything in the model itself. So the displacement map certainly, on the pants and on some of these parts certainly plays a role in the overall quality of the mesh, but the meshes are built so that I can potentially send a mesh of this resolution into Substance Painter and texture paint on it. Or, in some cases I can send out a slightly higher res version and do the texture painting on there. But if you're relying really, really, really heavily on displacement mapping, then you either need to do the texture painting on the really high poly mesh in Substance Painter, or I haven't done a ton with kind of doing that transfer of trying to get displacement maps into something like Substance Painter and tracing over details. So again, I think it comes down to personal workflow, that I like my meshes to basically encompass as much information as possible so that it does allow me to texture paint relatively easily. So yeah, Substance Painter was used pretty heavily. I mean, the ability to kind of get in there and pretty quickly add edge wear and use the generators in there to do texture work, it allowed me to work pretty quickly on a lot of different objects.
Cool. And do you ever use a Mudbox for any texturing work as well? And also, do you find it easier to paint textures directly on the model, or flat 2D UVs?
So anytime I'm doing like organic stuff like skin, if I'm photo projecting on information for skin, I'll do that in Mudbox. I like the stencils and the way that Mudbox handles doing projections. Substance Painter lends itself, for me currently, it lends itself a little bit better to some of the hard surface elements, just because it has the generators in there for doing edge wear. Let me bring up one of the assets in Painter here. And again, this also, Substance Painter files can get really, really big really quick because everything is encompassed in the file. So all the images are saved in the file. So this allows me to work, keeping things as sort of separate entities allows me to save some of these files pretty easily. Like if you start doing 4K or 8K textures in Substance Painter and you have the entire character in there, I mean, you could easily start getting an 8 to 10 gigabyte file with all that stuff. And it's not only a speed and efficiency thing, but good luck if that file gets corrupted or crashes, you've lost a ton of information. So yeah, this is one of the assets here. So this is broken up into a few different chunks or pieces. So I have the different flags up here. The helmet gear is all on its own material here. The goggles are on their own separate entity. And if we look at the helmet here, this is where Substance Painter worked really, really well. So being able to very quickly add scuffing or edge wear is really, really quick. So I don't necessarily have to come in here and hand paint all this stuff. I can leverage Substance Painter's ability to use the curvature maps, occlusion maps, world space normal maps to do a lot of this information. So, and it's essentially non-destructive too. So let me find. So I have some scuffing there. I just need to find the actual layer here. So I can turn all this stuff on and off. Let me just find.
And as you're looking for that.
Yes, so the edge wear here, for example, I can now come in here and, even from a production standpoint, if somebody comes in and says, there's too much edge wear on here, I can just come in here and now take down some of this edge wear and minimize that, or I can ramp it up even heavier. So it's really nice that I'm not actually hand painting this. It's being done with some of these generators. This allowed me to work pretty quickly through this character.
Cool. And what would you say and if you don't know, it's fine, but what would you say the difference is between, let's say, Substance, Mari, and Quixel?
Well, Mari I don't have a ton of experience with Mari. It's obviously geared more towards really high-end film and cinematic pipelines where you are dealing with a lot of, UV tiles and that sort of thing. And it handles, a lot of geometry and a lot of textures really, really efficiently. Substance Painter and Quixel are essentially the same things. Essentially, I mean they're basically operating very, very similarly. So whether you choose one or the other really isn't a big deal. They're both going to be able to achieve very similar types of things.
Cool. I think at that point it's just preference.
Yeah, it's preference. It's workflow. I mean, it depends on what you get comfortable with.
Cool. So as it relates to, as I said, it's like, there's so many questions and, we're about 5 minutes away,
Sure.
5 minutes off from the session. It's like Pete, has graciously allowed us to go about 10 minutes or so over the time. So just because we want to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. But all right. So shading, let's talk about shading.
Sure.
So what are you using for your, for shading? What are you using for rendering? And what is one of the most important, crucial aspects for achieving realistic skin shader?
So yeah, I do obviously all on my end. I use V-Ray for I'm actually relatively new to V-Ray. It took me a while to switch over from Mental Ray to V-Ray, but I'm really happy I switched to V-Ray. It just sort of works. It handles everything I throw at it. The shaders, I mean, everything it works really, really well. So for the skin shader, let me bring up the skin shader. So I generally find that, I'll do a photo projection on the character to get some base color, but a lot of times the photo projection. So even if we look at some of this stuff, sometimes even some of this information can sometimes contain a little bit too much detail and the skin can end up looking kind of dry. So I focus a lot of time on getting the actual shader set up properly to begin with without plugging in textures. And then I slowly start to add in texture information. And so I think it's important to not let the color information completely override what the shader is capable of doing. So if we look at the skin shader here, let's see. So I have a map plugged into overall color, which is just for some of the contact points between the stubble and the face itself. So just some black specks here just to kind of help the integration of the stubble with the skin underneath. But for most part, the overall color should be kept to white. Then I have a little bit of diffuse contribution just so it doesn't get too soft and waxy. The diffuse map is essentially the color information that's kind of desaturated but has a little bit of detail in here. And then I also have the subsurface color map, which is essentially kind of the under parts of the skin. So if I bring this in here, this is a little bit more saturated and has some additional detail in here. And then that's most of the skin shader look is coming from the contribution of the shader and then this subsurface map. You can see here that the diffuse contribution is only 0.15. And then the scatter radius, I generally find a lot of times the lips get a little bit too soft and waxy. So I use a map here just to knock back some of the subsurface radius on the lip region, just so they don't get too soft. And so that drives the scatter radius. I generally find that on initial tests, I make the scatter radius usually a little bit too high, and then I start to have to dial that down so it doesn't, again, feel too soft and waxy. And then I like to think of the skin as sort of two separate layers. If you look at this image here, this is essentially the skin, which has hardly any reflection on it. There's just maybe a little bit of a sheen coming off, a very, very broad sheen. Whereas if you compare to something like, I'll shoot a variety of different light setups. So something like this, there's certainly this like wet layer over the top of the skin that needs to be accounted for as well. So I like to think of the skin as sort of two separate things that need to be thought about. So there's like a general low specular amount on the skin itself, so it's very, very broad. And then there's a wet layer on top of that, which has the bump map plugged in as well. And then I have this broken up into two separate, there's kind of a broad specular and then a sharper one. So I'm basically combining two different speculars on top of the skin. This sort of breaks a little bit of like being completely physically accurate if you don't watch out for the values here. So this has a 0.75 amount and this has 0.15 amount. If you kind of do too much specular, then you get too much specular contribution and the skin is kind of reflecting back more light than it's actually receiving. So I just make sure that these values just that I don't kind of, and when they all kind of combine up, that they don't go too far over a complete value of 1. So say 0.75 here, 0.15 here, and then this has a little bit of reflection contribution as well. And so I find that the bump map plays a huge role in getting the proper look of the skin. And then there's a gloss map plugged in as well, which is actually fairly broad. It's just got a little bit of noise to it. As long as you have a pretty solid high frequency bump map, the gloss map can usually be pretty broad because the bump map itself is kind of breaking up the highlight for you. So gloss maps are kind of a cheat to essentially mimic roughness or smoothness of a surface. So as long as you got a pretty solid bump map, the gloss map can usually be fairly broad. I've just painted in a little bit brighter areas for like the tip of the nose, the wet parts of the eye, and then toned it back a little bit where like the beard would be, some of the stubble. And then with regards to actually making stuff feel a little bit more photographic or more realistic, I think I have a pretty strong background in photography and spend a lot of time shooting my own images. And I think it's important to have a little bit of an education on photography and kind of the balancing of light, how a camera captures light information. I think that's one of the, if we look on this image here, just really after having shot enough images in certain lighting conditions, I kind of just have become attuned to the ratio of light of how, what the value range would be in the shadow area compared to the sunlit side. And that's, I think, it's just an experience thing of just picking up a camera and shooting and really analyzing what happens when you crank up your shutter speed or turn the shutter speed down, and how much light it lets in the camera, and how highlights can start to blow out. So there's that. And then there's also, for example, like on this image here, just having a little bit more background and information on like studio lighting. So I watch a lot of videos and information on how studio portrait photographers do their studio lighting. And I found, there's good reference imagery out there. There's like this one here, which talks about a lot of different lighting setups that portrait photographers would use. So, Rembrandt lighting, there's split lighting, butterfly and loop lighting. There's different types of lighting that portrait photographers will use to create different types of looks and effects. there's butterfly lighting is kind of a beauty sort of lighting where the camera is just above the head and creates a nice little butterfly shaped shadow under the nose. We got this nice unique one over here, badger lighting, which I have yet to incorporate into any of my work, but maybe one day I can try that. But
hey, Pete, is that a website?
No, this was actually like I have this image. I looked up. It's from Digital Camera World. I think if you search Digital Camera World, I recently saw this on Facebook. There's a lot of these types of images floating around, but different lights have react differently. They cast sharper shadows or broad shadows, that type of thing. So I think having some sort of knowledge or doing a little bit of research on different types of lighting setups can be really, really helpful when you want to try to recreate and mimic certain things in your work.
Cool.
And so, yeah, I think the photography does play a nice, pretty strong role in just finding the right balance of light, balancing out the ambient light with sunlight to kind of get this type of look. And I also have, there's a variety of different lighting tests that I do just to see how things are working. So I'll do, place the light at different angles, and I use the V-Ray physical camera as well in Maya, which essentially mimics a real-world camera. So you have control over the shutter speed, the ISO, the aperture for controlling depth of field. So that comes in really handy as well, coming from a sort of photography background. That a lot of that stuff makes sense. So
cool, and it obviously shows. I remember when you first posted the pictures, it's like I had to do a double take because I'm like, is that just photograph references or?
Yeah, and actually V-Ray does a really good job. I mean, for the most part, I mean, this image here is just an HDRI dome light with one light mimicking the sun, and then from there, it's really just about finding the right balance of brightness. So when you talk about photography, if you're shooting an image of somebody who's in shadow and you want to capture the detail in the shadow, you got to set the camera up to basically expose and properly get the right values in the shadow area at the cost of sacrificing the highlight area. So the highlights start to actually blow out and get a little bit too bright.
Yeah.
So that sort of stuff is just, understanding how cameras work and how they actually capture that kind of light and the sacrifices that have to be made to capture particular parts. So, like this image here, you can see that, some of the shadow areas, in the shadows are starting to go pretty dark because I'm exposing a little bit more for the sunlit side. So that actually looks accurate, but the shadows start to go a little bit dark. So, and that's really just a matter of putting in the HDRI dome light and then ramping up the intensity of the sunlight to find that right ratio and right balance so that it renders properly.
Cool. No, dude, looks absolutely amazing, Pete. So let's jump ahead and let's talk about the class because we got about 5 minutes left.
Sure.
So let's just talk about what is the class? Give us an overview of what it covers, and also just how much interaction and personalized feedback that happens.
Sure. So it's actually we actually most of the courses are 10 weeks, but we actually made it into 11 weeks. I wanted to have the students be able to hit the ground running in week 1 because there's a ton of information that's covered in the typical 10 weeks. So sort of week 0 is looking at having the students spend the week before the class collecting reference, and then I'll look at the reference and make sure it's something that's doable and would be applicable to doing character art type work. And then week 1 gets into setting up the block out and trying to get things accounted for, so you have your silhouette and making sure that the character reads from a broad perspective and just getting all the different parts accounted for. Week 2 ends up moving into focusing on the head sculpt. Most the students who've gone through the curriculum, there's classes prior to the cinematics class, so there's an entire class devoted to doing heads. So by this point in the curriculum, they're comfortable enough with doing head sculpting that we spend a week on doing the head, getting the sculpt done, doing some high frequency bump painting, and getting a base kind of color projection on there. And then week 3 moves more into starting to do like weeks 3, 4, 5, and a little bit into 6 are mostly focused on different modeling. So, a week's kind of focused on clothing, doing organic kind of clothing stuff using a variety of tools, Marvelous Designer, doing sculpting. And then there's portions that are on hard surface elements, different techniques and tools for doing different types of hard surface modeling. And so again, this occurs a little bit later in the curriculum, so it's not, you know, showing, oh, here's how I model the exact, showing an entire lecture on the goggles, and then moving on to the, you know, the zipper, and then the mount for on the front of the helmet. It doesn't show every single object being modeled, but more of giving tools and techniques to approach and be able to problem solve different types of modeling tasks that you might be tasked with. So I mean, at the end of the day, you're really just generating different configurations of polygons, and so I think the tools, learning different types of tools to tackle specific problems is probably more important than showing every single specific thing being modeled. So we kind of cover a variety of different tools there. And then once we get out of, you know, some of that modeling, it's more, starts to get into, you know, UV layout, and then moving into texture painting, having organized meshes for texture painting, how best to break models up into sort of digestible chunks that are easy to texture paint. So we look at doing a bunch of work in Substance Painter with texture painting. And while a lot of this is going on, there also is some back and forth between this happens to me a lot, where I have to do a little bit of texture painting, and then I'll stop and get into Maya and start setting up some very basic shaders to start to test. Because, you know, Substance Painter does have a pretty cool viewport, and it does correlate fairly well to V-Ray, but there is still some tweaking that needs to be done. And so I get, you know, with any task that I go through, and this is shown in the course as well, is that I try to get things, you know, 60, 70, 80% of the way there, kind of get a lot of things covered, and then start to do loop back around and start to iterate things up and kind of start to polish things. So we'll look at some of that, and then look at tools and techniques and ways of correlating Substance Painter over to V-Ray. So I use a lot of V-Ray blend materials to blend between metals and like a raw aluminum with maybe paint on top. So looking at ways and techniques to set up your Substance Painter file so that you can easily output masks, so you can blend between, use a V-Ray blend material to blend those different shaders together. And then it gets, you know, once we get to like 8, 9, and 10, it starts to get into setting up the basic character rig, doing some posing, tying up loose ends, and then getting into setting up shaders and doing the lighting and rendering and post-processing. So it is a lot to cover. There's a lot of information in there.
Could you go to the other class page, Pete? Because I know there's the
part sure.
two.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So then it, you know, it goes more into texture painting, setting up shaders, and again, there's a ton of information to cover here. Again, the interesting thing about this character is there's a lot of I guess redundant things on the character, in the sense that you know, from the modeling sense, it, you know, doesn't make sense to show modeling every single hard surface element. It also, you know, not every single object is shown in terms of how it's shaded, but the techniques are essentially the same. Once you set up figure out the cloth shader, you know, it can be applied to a variety of different objects on the character with minimal tweaking, setting up different shaders for the different types of helmet elements. So we look at different shader parameters, how to create accurate and realistic metals, plastics, cloth, rubber, you know, all the different types of materials that may encompass a character. We kind of look at the variety of different ways to generate those and what parameters need to be set properly to get that realistic type of look. So the cool thing is V-Ray is physically accurate, and so once you get a handle and understand what settings and what parameters need to be tweaked and how they need to be tweaked, you can start to make some pretty interesting and realistic materials relatively quickly.
Cool.
So yeah, so that covers pretty much the entire.
That covers most of it. And how much interaction and personalized feedback happens throughout the course?
Yeah, so every week there's an assignment every week. You know, each artist is obviously working on their own type of character, so everyone kind of has different technical hurdles to overcome, and so I help the students with that. So there's an assignment every week. Students submit their assignments at the end of the week, and then you know, I look at everyone's work and do a like 10 to 15 minute recorded feedback for each student. And then a couple days after all of the feedback is done, then there's a live hour-long Q&A to kind of clear up any issues or demo anything that needs to be demoed, or, you know, anything like that. So there is, a good amount of interaction every week to get questions answered and to get critiques and kind of steer things in the right direction.
Cool. And I have to say, having worked with Pete with CGMA, the attention to detail and to the students that, in terms of feedback and answering their questions and everything is absolutely amazing. It's his mentorship in terms of how he approaches definitely more of a mentorship style. So
cool.
And we're really happy to have, Pete's instructor. And and unfortunately it has to be the last thing, but could you just show us some of the student work that you have from your class?
Yeah, so some of this stuff is from different parts of the process, but these are some from the earlier head sculpts. This is David Alcor, who did a really cool barbarian character. This is kind of where he was steering it by getting closer to the end of the course. He there's a lot of content that's covered, so he chose to focus a little bit more on the upper portions of the character. And so he did a really cool job. If we look at like this image here, he's starting to get dialing the skin shader, working with hair, getting everything. And we kind of steered this into a pretty cool direction. Gabriel Chang was working on a cool head. This is from, again, a little bit later on once we started getting into the skin shading. So he really started to get this, getting this close to being finished and polished. So this was looking really cool. And then we also have, images like this. This is Leia. We were working through different shader setups, and she was, one of the things that I heavily suggest to all the students is to kind of do test renders, play around with the different settings, and do comparison, do side-by-side comparison, so you can really see, the impact that certain settings are having and how things are changing. So, and she's actually, this was kind of her first go at learning and using V-Ray. So she was getting starting to get a pretty nice skin shader set up, getting the textures on there. So, it's interesting too, because it can sometimes be hard to assess and look at a character without seeing everything intact. But one of the methods that we use to kind of go over stuff is to kind of build up things in individual steps. So she was doing a really cool job here with setting up the shader, then hooking up bump maps, looking at the gloss and specular as completely separate entities, and then starting to layer it back on top, just so you have an understanding of the impact that each layer is having on the skin itself. So yeah, there's a variety of different, this was from an earlier, from like week 2 or 3, from blocking things out. So everyone was kind of doing different types of characters, but everyone was kind of getting things up to pretty solid levels pretty quick. It's just it is an insane amount of work to try to do a full character while learning everything in like a 10-week period. So, but all of this work that's been done serves as a really, really good jumping off point to continue to iterate on things and build things up. So everyone's kind of had things at different phases at different points. And that's one of the things when you're working on a character, you can kind of come up with a workflow that sort of works, but every time you build a new character, every character presents its own set of unique problems that you have to tackle. And I think that's some of the stuff that we've gone over too, is, how best to tackle certain problems and what the best approach is, what steps should be taken at what points to get characters up to a particular level. So yeah, all the student work was looking really cool. They've been doing some cool work. And like I said, 10 weeks is a pretty short amount of time to get things up to a completely finished level. But having gone through all the lectures, by the end, they were all producing really, really solid work that, moving forward and wrapping those characters up, I'm still going to be in touch with those students as well to kind of help them along and give them some critique and feedback as they wrap those characters up. So,
definitely. So some of the stuff that the guys were creating looks absolutely amazing. I love that Gambit looking character as well.
Yeah. There's some really, really cool work being done. So, students are doing some nice work. Yeah.
And I know a lot of you guys are asking in terms of, what skill set do you have to be to take this class? You don't have to take the entire program, the character arts program, but you definitely do need to be at a certain level to take some of the more advanced classes, whether it's Pete's class, character creation for cinematics, or even Damon's class, which is the character creation for games. You have to be at a certain level. So submit a portfolio. you could just email us and submit a portfolio, and we'll be able to assess whether or not we think you'll be a good fit for the class. But the entire program is, once again, it's very character creation specific. It's character artist specific. So you don't have to take the entire program, but definitely you have to be at a certain level to take the different classes. But it starts off with anatomy. It goes from human anatomy. We have 2 classes on that: animal anatomy, creature sculpting, character casting, character texturing for films and cinematics and games. Then it goes into Pete's class, which is character creation for cinematic. And then the last class was just character creation for games. And then there's a demo reel block where we have different supervisors of different studios come in and kind of help take that art to the next level. So yeah, the classes are available separately. Definitely check out the website. I've already sent, I think I sent a link, but I'll send it again so you guys have it. And yeah, Pete,
Cool.
absolutely amazing. Thank you
Thanks.
so much for an amazing session. Thank you everybody for attending. I know we went on, a little longer. So thank you so much, Pete, for taking your, time out of your lunch break to,
Sure
help
thing.
kind of give us a better insight for, just how you go about creating some of these amazing characters. So
Yeah,
thank
that's
you
cool.
again, guys. And I guess we'll see you guys next week for another session. We'll be sending out some more information on that. So thank you again, Pete.
Cool.
And
Yeah, you're
I'll talk to
welcome.
you later.
All right, dude. Take care. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye-bye.